Well, I'm grateful to be here at Rieth Village and to talk about this site where we've worked on sustainable design and construction principles. But the core concept to keep in mind is we were doing all of this so that undergraduate students could really learn and experience in the field sustainability concepts, all the way from sustainable agriculture to sustainability leadership. And those are the two core residential programs that happen on this site. The idea for working on a facility like this emerged when we first began creating curricular ideas for undergraduate students to learn at Mary Lee. We said that when students come to Mary Lee, we don't want them just to kind of walk casually through an ecosystem, which is a great thing to do, but to actually be immersed into the setting and to spend longer blocks of time. And when we said, well, what do we mean by longer blocks of time? It was like, well, like a whole summer or a whole semester. So that gave kind of the core idea of what we wanted to accomplish. And as soon as we said we wanted to develop these kind of curricular ideas, we said, well, if we're going to do those, we should design something that has high levels of environmental friendliness. We didn't even quite know what terms to use to describe what we were talking about. I mean, that's turned into talking about green buildings and sustainable design and construction, but that core commitment objective is all the same. One of the fun things here at Mary Lee is that we have a lot of land spaces and a lot of different choices of where we could put buildings. We ultimately decided this was a good spot for several reasons. One, we were not too far away from the farmstead, which was a homesteaded farm that was built in the late 1800s. We knew that having this kind of distance would be helpful because we could use that facility for certain things, and yet this would have its own programming space. We also recognized that we were standing where we're standing now and where Rieth Village is built is just an old farm field where we had never done a land restoration project. The idea was there, but all that had happened in this land post-farming was to periodically take a large tractor with a brush hog unit and knock down all the noxious weeds and brush that was growing up here. So that meant this was kind of an open palette where you weren't redoing something you had already started on. So choosing this site was an important step. We also chose this site because it has a little bit of slope. We don't have a lot of gradient change in our landscape around here, but we had a slope that was facing to the south, which is a good thing when you're trying to incorporate both passive and active solar into a building system. So how do you decide what you want to build? Well, first of all, you think about the programmatic needs. And so we wanted students to live in residence on site. We also knew that they would need some kind of gathering space and some kind of eating space, those core concepts. So we developed a general programmatic design, but then to really get into how do we want to make sure we're designing this in a sustainable fashion took a lot of work. It meant for us to become more educated ourselves. I, for example, traveled to a variety of green conferences around the country there in the late 90s, early 2000s. Learned a lot of insights. I love building, so it was just pretty natural for me to pick up on a lot of the concepts that were being taught. And it enabled us to be able to ask better questions of people we would be working with. Whether that would be an architect, an engineer, or a contractor. We also wanted to do our best to design sustainably using local expertise. But we also knew that there was some limit to local expertise having actually studied and immersed themselves into green architecture. We made a contact and built a relationship with an architect out of Fort Wayne and they were very enthusiastic about the project. It was a very good relationship, and yet we knew we needed a little more than that. So I actually, on one of my trips, traveled to Snowmass, Colorado to meet with the people at Rocky Mountain Institute. And there I talked with Bill Browning and another colleague about what our idea was. And they said, well, one of the ways we could help you is we're not into designing the building, but we can help with the planning process. And we can lead a charrette, an intensive design workshop, where we would have a whole bunch of stakeholders or people committed to the concept meet together and talk about what is it you really want to accomplish. So we gathered in August of 2001. They facilitated this gathering of about 30 people. They brought in 6 different people who represented expertise in various aspects of sustainable design. So that included architecture, building envelope, lighting, interior design. It included wastewater treatment. It included landscape architecture. So kind of this whole system thought. And that was a very important choice to be made because to achieve sustainable design, you need an integrative understanding of what's going on in the buildings on the landscape in which they're placed. Too often, one relies purely on an architect who brings a lot of skills to the table, but they don't represent all the building disciplines. So having that charrette incorporate all of those components was very helpful. And as a result of a 2-day workshop, which included Mary Lee staff members, Mary Lee board members, Goshen College students, some Goshen College administrators, our own architectural team was also there as an amazing gathering. And we also included the Noble County Building Department and invited them to come. And they came and listened to the main presentations by these 6 professionals coming from across the country. As a result of that, we ended up with a list of objectives we wanted to accomplish in the buildings. And right at the end of the workshop, Bill Browning said to me, he said, you know that I've been working on the LEED rating system with the U.S. Green Building Council. What if we would go through those 69 points and see how our objectives stack up to that? And I said, sure. So Bill took us like in an hour, hour and a half. We went through the 69 points, talked about the objectives we had picked in those 2 days. And as a group, we realized that we, without even intending to, had designed the core concepts for a platinum-rated building. And that has always been a rewarding thing to know because we weren't cherry-picking to build a platinum building somehow. Not that that would be wrong, because there would be benefits from doing that. But the idea that we had identified core objectives that we felt were essential for a healthy green building, and it turned out to match the platinum rating with the U.S. Green Building Council. Long story short, as we designed and then constructed and did the rating, we did achieve the platinum goal. And so that's a nice reminder of that work. But I think more importantly than that is we actually, in this process, made a high commitment to integrative design. And I think anybody who visits this site needs to understand that that's the core part of the story. The core part of the story is not that, oh, you have to build buildings to look like these buildings to be green. It's the process behind it that leads to a green, sustainably designed building. So that interconnecting of all the disciplines with each other was important. We had such wonderful conversations as a design team post Rocky Mountain Institute charrette, where the design team would gather together, and I had made it very clear as the client owner that with the team that everybody's idea counted. So if the engineer wanted to make some kind of comment about a landscape sustainable design, they could do that. If the landscape person wanted to make some kind of comment about how we were treating wastewater, they could do that. And somebody couldn't say, you need to be quiet because that's not your discipline. That was not an option. And they all loved it because it meant everybody could be open, you could learn from each other. Everybody was out there reading and learning. So why limit just to what one discipline has been reading and learning. And as we develop these relationships, even years later, design team members that was one of the greatest experiences to do that. And what I also know is that these individuals have tried their best to incorporate this into other projects they've worked on as well, so to say that that's an important thing. A really key driver in whether this is going to work or not is when the client owner says this is an important thing and is maybe resolute enough, as I am, to say, we're designing this building and I really am enjoying and appreciating all your input, but please remember that when we're all said and done, the building belongs to Mary Lee. It doesn't belong to any of the rest of you. So we're working toward a goal beyond ourselves. And I think that helped everybody as well, just to kind of know that. So we weren't designing these buildings to have the architects' names on the buildings or some other designer's name on the building. The reality is we ended up picking soil types to name our buildings after instead, which is a pretty well-grounded thing to do.
How do you think having this built infrastructure shapes the culture or the experience for the people who interact with it?
One of the things that we realized early on in our planning, and I think it came through reading that various members of the design team or Mary Lee people were doing, was to recognize that the buildings are going to be teachers in and of themselves. So David Orr's article on the pedagogy of architecture was one of the influential readings that we had done. And so David Orr, as a leading environmental educator teaching at Oberlin College, said that your buildings are always going to be there, and the way they function and the way people interact with them will be part of the instruction. So one of the real early commitments we made was that we wanted this place to be a learning community. So to design the buildings and their arrangement with each other so that a learning community could develop was part of the plan. So we've built 3 main buildings, 2 that are student cottage residences, and 1 where the kitchens are and some meeting places are and some offices are. So arranging them as a little village was one of the ways to say, learning community is what's going to happen here. And then programmatically eating together. So we chose not to put full kitchens in the individual cottages, only in the main building. We actually have a much larger plan beyond these 3 buildings. We have 4 more student cottages. We have a large academic building that was part of this whole bigger planning process. But the learning community concept was always there as a way to say, when students or participants come to gather here and learn here, they're going to do it in relationship with each other, as participants, as instructors, as the land, as the buildings, all incorporated with each other. So that was a very essential design principle that we kept in mind, and it's also why we ended up naming this Rieth Village, because it's the village or community concept that is part of it. I think the other one of the other ways that a student participant person learns through the building is engaging with how the building is designed and put together that makes sense. People catch on when something makes sense. Sometimes you have to be told, or I have to be told, that this makes sense. And once you see it, it's like, sure, why wouldn't everybody do it that way? And I've had multiple people say that kind of thing after observing, so that's how you did that to accomplish a more sustainable goal. And students themselves can have conversations about it, which also means people can say, well, why didn't you do this? And it's like, it's too bad you weren't part of the planning, because that's a good idea. Or, on the other hand, sometimes you can say, we thought about that, but we also had to make choices. You can't do every green idea in a single project. because at certain points, one green idea is going to run into conflict with another green idea. So we wanted to have solar panels on our roofs, and we wanted to collect the rainwater, and we wanted to have a second story, and we didn't want the building to be too high, so we ended up with this kind of a slope, which would not accommodate a vegetative green roof, which is a great concept, but instead this is a green roof because it has white roofing material that has the solar arrays, both water heating and photovoltaic array on it. It captures all the rainwater. So all of those goals are accomplished, but having a vegetative green roof would not fit in this system, even though they're really cool. One of the things that we're able to see just as we stand here and look around, obviously a wind turbine and solar energy production. I typically refer to those things last in presentations. There's the assumption that that's what made these buildings green, and that's not the case. We would have been very close to achieving the platinum rating without having either one of those. And what that really means is the way you put a building together intentionally and carefully, and conserving energy is the goal, is the way to achieve green design, rather than just throwing some decorative things on there. Now, these are not just decorative, but I'm overstating that because that's where people often want to focus, and they're not addressing the bigger issues of how much energy are you using in the first place. So we reduced the amount of energy required for these buildings by 60% over a very good standard. So taking a very good standard for the amount of energy that would be used to heat, cool, and light buildings like this, and saying we're going to beat that good standard by 60%. And we've proven that to be, we knew that would most likely turn out that way by using energy modeling, and our engineer could use the best available tools for energy modeling during the design process. But we have the data now, so we know it's true that compared to a well-designed base case building, we have reduced it by 60%. And to me, that's conservation is such a critical first step. I'm very pro alternative energy and know we need to work on that as well. And we were technically able to do both of those in this project. Another main learning on this beautiful day is that we have a wind turbine running and we have a solar array running, and it's not particularly hot or cold here today, which means we most likely are producing more energy than we're consuming in these three buildings today, which is fun. The thing that most people assume here in northern Indiana is that you need to have wind turbines because it's windy, and solar systems don't make sense because it's cloudy. And that's a correct assumption about our general climate in northern Indiana, that we get a lot of cloudy days and we get a fair amount of windy days. But the reality is the reverse of that when it comes around to choosing an alternative energy system. So the solar array is about 5 kilowatts of potential, and the wind turbine is 10 kilowatts of potential. So the wind turbine has twice the potential for producing energy as the solar array. And yet our data shows that annually the solar array at half the potential beats the wind turbine 2 and sometimes 3 to 1 in terms of total annual output. And that information has been helpful for a number of other projects around our area, because people have been drawn to the wind turbine because you can see them, they're moving, they're exciting. But if you're talking about payback on your investment, the solar array is very much the way to go, even in northern Indiana where it's cloudy during a bunch of the winter time. And I know that's true. It's been true on my own personal solar energy. It's been true on these, as well as many other projects that have followed that same concept. One of the big goals here was to pay attention to the land where the buildings were being placed. And so we see here this beautiful spring flowering, and it's not what you typically think of flowering, but the beauty that you see in the native grasses and flowers from last summer. And this is burned off every year or every other year, and you get a new flush of amazing, beautiful vegetation. We were choosing this for several reasons. One is we just knew it was the right thing to do, being of the mindset we are, but also recognizing by having this kind of landscape, we have beauty that does not require large amounts of fossil fuel. It's only burned once a year or maybe every 2 years. It doesn't require any fertilizer. It doesn't require any watering. And so you get this beautiful aspect of your design without having the huge impact on the environment. And on top of that, this system helps to absorb all the rainwater and less runoff from the site. As we look down the hill this direction, we can see that there's a depression, which was a natural depression in this landscape that we closed off with a little bit of diking, which created a rain garden. So our goal was to capture all of the rainwater that falls on site, some of it captured on the roof to go into a cistern to flush toilets, to do the laundry, etc. But the rest of the rain falling on the site can end up in a rain garden, and all of the rainwater that falls on this building site is absorbed back into the aquifer and recharges the aquifer with good quality water. We were able to do that with relatively simple systems, and systems that can be alternately be designed or developed in larger urban settings or rural settings. And so it's been a very instructive place just in using these kinds of systems. We do treat all of our wastewater on site, and you can see a rock ridge around our wetland cell down there where all of our wastewater goes. The wastewater treatment system is using native wetland plants in a bed on top of a rubber liner, and our wastewater from our commodes and showers and sinks all goes through that and is treated and meets Indiana standards for treated wastewater without using any chemicals and very little energy for moving any water through the system. So as we're looking at these buildings today, I'm reminded of one of the fun conversations, one of many fun conversations with the Rocky Mountain Institute charrette. And one of those was, so what do we want the building vernacular to be? Like, what statement should they be making? And they invited us to talk about places that we felt good about when we were in nature, and the kinds of buildings we encountered when we were in nature. And so a lot of different ideas were thrown out and put on a board, and we I guess voted on them some way. And we came up with a statement that said, we want to create rugged elegance. Because we recognize kind of a rustic ruggedness was often what you felt when you went into a state park and felt good. There's a certain ruggedness when you're in the rural landscape. But we also wanted something that felt like it had architectural appeal and elegance to it. And so as you look at the external features of these buildings, you see the white elegant roofs, you see the rough-sawn tulip poplar, locally harvested tulip poplar, the state tree of Indiana. And so those choices were not made because of rugged elegance, but they also were driven by the fact that that's the kind of look that we wanted to have. And we were pleased with how that came out. The white roofing was picked not just so it would be white and fancy. It was really picked because the white material has the right levels of conductivity, emissivity, etc., that make it a green roof. In other words, it reduces the heating and cooling load on the building. It was also picked because it's 90% recycled material and it's totally recyclable. It also was picked because it has very long durability, which durability is part of a key factor in sustainability, and it collects rainwater very well. So you have all these multiple layers of why one picks a particular thing and the way each of those components can support each other. As we were building these buildings, we were doing conversations about, so how long do we want these buildings to last anyway? We knew that the typical building, in this era of North American building, are built under a 20-year net present value concept. That means that you want the building to produce enough outputs for your intended purpose that you recover your costs in 20 years or less. And then you can basically discard your building and go on and make another one and do that all over again, and you keep having a good return on investment. Well, that doesn't fit at all within the value system that we have for regenerative and sustainable design. We wanted durability, long-term lasting in the things that we were putting together here. So the metal roofing is one of those examples of a material that's going to last a good 100 years. It would take a very violent storm like a tornado to rip that apart. It's not going to fall apart for any other reason. That means that over the lifetime of these buildings, you probably would have to put at least 3 different asphalt shingle roofs on this. There's no good recycling purpose for asphalt shingles. These roofs are totally recyclable. So while it costs additional money to buy that material up front, it saves itself over and over again throughout the lifetime of the building. So by making that wiser choice, we have benefited some executive director and set of Mary Lee team members that have not even been born yet. And so thinking this multiple generation concept when you're designing a building is so important. So we were thinking at least 100 years on our buildings. We realized that it requires some maintenance. You've got to have people come and make sure that boards aren't falling off the walls, but those boards that are there are going to last probably 75 years as long as they're kept intact. They don't need any stains or sprays or finishes on them if they're kept under a good roof and out of the soil. So again, long-term things. The foundations are going to last hundreds of years because of how well they're built, as well as the general structure. But we were working at least on a 100-year concept. So in other words, getting 5 times as much life out of a building compared to this 20-year net present value idea. So therefore, people jumped to the conclusion that you had to throw a whole lot more money at building green buildings than the typical building. Well, the reality is no, we didn't. We spent a 10% premium to build a platinum facility over building a non-rated building system. So it's a 10% added cost by choosing more insulation, better roofing, better windows, quality heating and cooling systems that will perform well. So the reality then is that 10% premium ends up being paid for, the return on investment is 10 years or less. The fact that we moved into these buildings for the first time April of 2006 means that we now are 13 years in to using these buildings, which means we're already 3 years into the saving side. It doesn't seem like that long ago when we moved in here. And so we actually built the lesser expensive buildings when you look at the full cost accounting approach that we were paying attention to in this system.
That's great.
So why doesn't everybody build green? We need a brain adjustment. But the reality is we do need a number of adjustments. We still have not, I'm talking collectively in society in North America, have not adjusted to that full cost accounting concept as part of our economic system. We still rely on things that are inexpensive, like fossil fuel, as being a very inexpensive energy source. Now, fortunately, that is changing, but it's changing too slowly, in my opinion. Lending institutions have not developed creative plans for rewarding people who build green, and that could easily be done. Both the lending institution and the owner would benefit from that, as well as then the societal benefit for a healthier set of building systems. So there are these big switches that have to be made in the larger systems to accomplish some of those goals.